Hey guys, this is Tyler here in Estonia, and I'm going to talk about a very interesting concept here, and that is why I think dating apps could become obsolete in the next 10 years. Okay, so dating apps have been kind of big now for the past 5 to 10 years in most of the world. There's almost no country, honestly, where you won't find dating apps available. I don't know about North Korea. Perhaps North Korea has dating apps. I wouldn't be surprised. And if there's one thing dating apps have demonstrated is that they pretty much show the worst that you can find in both men and women, and probably more so in women. Dating apps have been terrible in terms of how it's brought out the worst qualities in both genders here, but especially in women. There's a scarcity effect often that's created on dating apps, and I realize that often there's been studies done, and many dating apps typically have a ratio that's anywhere between 60 to 80% men compared to like 20 to 35% female. This in itself just shows why they often don't work too well. Because often the stats that are shown are that like 90% of women seek out 10% of the guys. But what they don't also state is that on some of these apps, there's not a lot of women that are on them in the first place, and especially ones that are younger, which I think should in itself make guys feel better if they have some success or they don't have success, that like there's not a lot of younger women on these apps in the first place. And this is actually really important to realize. But dating apps have obviously greatly replaced PUA, as I discussed before, etc. And these apps tend to give a lot of attention to the small number of women that are on these apps. And of course, there's apps for all ages. There's ones for teens up to 70 or 80 years old. One thing though that has been consistent here is that prices of these apps has gone down. If we look at the first dating websites like eHarmony, Match.com, these were like at least $100 per month, just basic usage. This didn't include other fees. I think it was, some of them were like $200 to $300 a month. And they were certainly more selective, the kind of person that used these applications. And I think they actually had higher success rates because it was more serious people using them. And they were also more catered for an audience that was above 30. As time went on, some developers realized that maybe if we started catering to teens up to late 20s, would get a much larger audience, and that's certainly what happened. And this is obviously when the real revenue started coming into these companies. Apps like Tinder and Baidu took off big time. There was absolutely a golden age for guys to be on these apps. I think maybe 5 years ago. I recall when I first used Tinder like 4 years ago in Russia, this was a fantastic time to be on Tinder in Russia. And I think it's, from what I've heard, has declined a lot even in Russia, Tinder, and it probably will just continue to decline in the future. What I see though is that more and more guys are just not using these dating apps anymore. There's a steadily declining number, and also of guys willing to pay to use. They may use free subscription accounts, but they will not pay because they see it as a waste of time. They get very few matches, or they get no matches, and it doesn't seem worth it for them. They may get matches, get some messages, and then the girl doesn't follow up with them. And this is actually more common for the average guy on a dating app. It's probably the norm for 70 or 80% of guys. And then another 10% of guys get some matches, maybe get some dates, but it's not great, the options that they get. And then a small percentage, it could be between 3 to 10% in some countries, get most of the matches, and they also get most of the dates here. And also realize, I think, that a lot of the women on these dating apps, there's a very large percentage that aren't even seeking to go on dates in the first place. They're just seeking attention from guys. So when we look at the statistics from that perspective, if the app has only like 30% women, and if less than half of those are even interested in dating, that's a very small percentage of women that are even there to date, and compared to the number of men on those dating apps. And the picture starts to be more clear, and people can understand why it often doesn't work for so many guys. I really think though dating apps were something of the millennial generation, also Generation X to a degree, but for Generation Z, especially for men, I see a big drop off in interest. Many men of this generation are not as interested in these dating apps. They're not as interested dating at all. But also in dating apps, I think the millennials were much more interested. The guys were much more keen to try out these dating apps and see if they work. I myself have used a few dating apps, and I have had some success, I will say, but unfortunately not for long-term relationships. What we're seeing though, I think, is that Generation Z as a whole of men are just not as interested worldwide in dating. And I also see that I think the hypergamy is changing a bit, the dynamic. I noticed that in many countries, more females that are in Z generation are much more interested now in guys that are a good deal older, pretty decent sized age gaps. My last girlfriend was Generation Z. All the girls that I went out with when I was living in Russia, in fact, were Generation Z. And I know of other guys in Russia. I know guys that are older. I have one acquaintance, actually, he just got married. His wife actually was Generation Z, and he's 34 years old. I see this age gap preference is becoming more common, and I think some of this is due to the changing economics in many countries. It's obvious many economies obviously are really struggling, and I think this age gap preference is also one of the reasons less Generation Z guys are interested in online dating, because they realize that older guys, not real old guys, but older, perhaps guys that are just a generation ahead of them, they realize that these guys have more advantage than them in the dating marketplace, especially in certain countries. In bigger countries, absolutely, I think this is the case. With economics changing, and economic times like currently are really having a large effect on the younger population. Less guys are interested in the concept of dating and of being in a relationship than prior. There's been, of course, these girl power movements, Me Too movements, and all these other things that guys are more afraid of having issues with and affecting their future. And many of these guys also, of course, grew up in dysfunctional families without proper father figures and without a mother-father family structure. So they were brought up in a way where they don't really understand how to be as a man, and how to both initiate and to make a relationship last. This is among many other factors here, of course, that are in the equation. Now, there's other aspects, I think, too, that are also going to become bigger forces. I think virtual reality, augmented reality, and basically robots that could take the place of a person in the future. But especially like hologram kind of virtual reality, I think may become something bigger. And these types of areas could very much take precedence over online dating. Do I think this is going to become like totally replace real people dating in 10 years? No, I don't think so. In 20 years, I don't think so either. But maybe, I don't know, honestly. Things like augmented reality, though, could replace areas like online dating in this particular aspect of dating. I still think people are going to meet like face to face, and there's still going to be human interaction. But I would see the robots as being the area that would actually replace like the human face-to-face interaction. I believe that these other like augmented reality and VRs, it's just not real enough. There's no human connection. There's no actual physical contact. Just like online dating, a lot of it is just virtual. It's until you meet with the person, there's no face-to-face connection. So I think until they have robots that were on par with human contact, I think it would be very hard to replace this area. Now, other problems in the near future is that, like we're seeing now, countries may start imposing more restrictions on movement of travel and being able to go from place to place. And if this happens, this could start a whole new era. It could be like rewinding many decades ago. If people can't really travel too much from country to country, this could also have a big impact on the dating market, because people then will be forced to look at the domestic dating market and be happy with that market. They wouldn't be as able to look at other markets like they could just recently. 10 years ago, this may not be as much of an option, especially if they keep a lot of these restrictions on travel on average people in the near future. I also see the widening gap between the wealthy and the poor. This will actually have impact, I think, on dating apps and their success. Well, dating apps, of course, rely on this aspect of hypergamy. It's worked for so long. Many guys going for these girls, but a very small number of gals going for the guys on these dating apps. I don't know, and I don't think this model will work in the next 10 years. I think that it's actually going to eventually burn out. There's not, maybe it will work. I just don't see it. I like I said before, I see like virtual and augmented reality as being much more viable replacements for this kind of model in the future. The next thing that also could happen is countries and politicians could put restrictions on dating apps and could start imposing very rigid laws that could affect the way these dating apps can function and operate. These companies could essentially be shut down. Look at what happened with TikTok. And this could be a very real thing. We don't know. If countries start deciding to do this, other countries likely will follow. And these apps could essentially become totally taken down. And this would, of course, have a huge impact on the dating landscape overnight. One other facet, and I see this more often, especially with younger generation, is the low trust aspect of young generation is, I think, becoming more of an issue. And some of this may be because of the growth in certain demographics, but I've noticed with like Generation Z that they tend to be very bad for the word. I think millennials are the same way, but I think it's even worse with Generation Z. Extremely unreliable in my experience with both male and females. And maybe it's because they're still younger. But I don't think it's just that. I think when you lack ability to facilitate relationships in person, face to face, and where dialogue means something, where when people used to use a phone, when I remember when my parents had to use like traditional phones, when you called someone, when you didn't have cell phones, people had to follow through. Like if you were scheduling to meet someone, there was no way that you could just cancel. And if you did, it would look very bad on the other person. As time progressed, of course, millennials saw the biggest change. It was easier for people not to follow their word on anything. And this has reached new levels with Generation Z. Both that, not being able to facilitate contact face-to-face in a way that's previous generations. It's low trustability. This low trustworthiness is one of the big factors that I think it doesn't matter what kind of online application platform you have. If the low trust factor is there, nothing else really matters. And this is both common I see in men and women of this generation. This is a very common problem, and I hope it changes. But I mean, I saw this a lot with millennials, with the women, not as bad with the guys, but I mean, it was still there very much. But with both guys and girls, it's very prevalent with Generation Z. This is one of the big factors why I don't see these dating apps reaching the same levels like they did before, because there's still that human part of it. There's still has to be some integrity there. This isn't empty talk, but it will be very interesting to see how the next 10 or 20 years progress for dating apps, and I look forward to your opinions here. So thank you.